Part 2, Chapter 16 of the Story of the Barbary Corsairs by Stanley Lane-Poole. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by James K. White. Chapter 16, Galleys and Galley Slaves, 16th Century. The Corsairs, says Heddo, are those who support themselves by continual sea robberies, and admitting that among their numbers some of them are natural Turks, Moors, etc., yet the main body of them are renegadoes from all parts of Christendom, all who are extremely well acquainted with the Christian coasts. It is a singular fact that the majority of these plunderers of Christians were themselves born in the faith. In the long list of Algerine viceroys we meet with many a European. Barbarossa himself was born in Lesbos, probably of a Greek mother. His successor was a Sardinian. Soon afterwards a Corsican became Pasha of Algiers, then another Sardinian. Ochiali was a Calabrian. Ramadan came from Sardinia, and was succeeded by a Venetian, who in turn gave place to a Hungarian, who made room for an Albanian. In 1588 the 35 galleys or galleots of Algiers were commanded by 11 Turks and 24 renegades, including nations of France, Venice, Genoa, Sicily, Naples, Spain, Greece, Calabria, Corsica, Albania, and Hungary, and a Jew. In short, up to nearly the close of the 16th century, but much more rarely afterwards, the chiefs of the Corsairs and the governors were commonly drawn from Christian lands. Some of them volunteered, and to the outlaws of Europe the command of a Barbary galley was perhaps the only congenial resort. But most of them were captives seized as children and torn from their homes in some of the Corsairs' annual raids upon Corsica and Sardinia and the Italian or Dalmatian coasts. Most of such prisoners were condemned to menial and other labors unless ransomed, but the bolder and handsomer boys were often picked out by the penetrating eye of the reïs, and once chosen the young captive's career was established. While the Christians with their galleys are at repose, sounding their trumpets in the harbors, and very much at their ease regaling themselves, passing the day and night in banqueting, cards, and dice, the Corsairs at pleasure are traversing the east and west seas, without the least fear or apprehension, as free and absolute sovereigns thereof. Nay, they roam them up and down, no otherwise than do such as go in chase of hares for their diversion. They here snap up a ship laden with gold and silver from India, and there another richly fraught from Flanders. Now they make prize of a vessel from England, then of another from Portugal. Here they board and lead away one from Venice, then one from Sicily, and a little further on they swoop down upon others from Naples, Livorno, or Genoa, all of them abundantly crammed with great and wonderful riches, and at other times carrying with them as guides renegadoes, of which there are in Algiers vast numbers of all Christian nations. Nay, the generality of the Corsairs are no other than renegadoes, and all of them exceedingly well acquainted with the coasts of Christendom, and even within the land. They very deliberately, even at noonday, or indeed just when they please, leap ashore and walk on without the least dread, and advance into the country 10, 12, or 15 leagues or more. And the poor Christians, thinking themselves secure, are surprised unawares. Many towns, villages, and farms sacked, and infinite numbers of souls, men, women, children, and infants at the breast, dragged away into a wretched captivity. With these miserable ruined people, loaded with their own valuable substance, they retreat leisurely, with eyes full of laughter and content, to their vessels. In this manner, as is too well known, they have utterly ruined and destroyed Sardinia, Corsica, Sicily, Calabria, the neighborhoods of Naples, Rome, and Genoa, all the Balearic Isles, and the whole coast of Spain, in which last more particularly they feasted as they think fit, on account of the Moriscos who inhabit there, who, being all more zealous Mohammedans than are the very Moors born in Barbary, they receive and caress the Corsairs, and give them notice of whatever they desire to be informed of. insomuch that before these Corsairs have been absent from their abodes much longer than perhaps 20 or 30 days, they return home rich, with their vessels crowded with captives, and ready to sink with wealth. In one instant, and with scarce any trouble, reaping the fruits of all that the avaricious Mexican and greedy Peruvian have been digging from the bowels of the earth with such toil and sweat, and the thirsty merchant with such manifest perils has for so long been scraping together, and has been so many thousand leagues to fetch away, either from the east or west, with inexpressible danger and fatigue. Thus they have crammed most of the houses, the magazines, and all the shops of this den of thieves with gold, silver, pearls, amber, spices, drugs, silks, cloths, velvets, etc., whereby they have rendered this city the most opulent in the world, insomuch that the Turks call it, not without reason, their India, their Mexico, their Peru. One has some trouble in realizing the sort of navigation employed by Corsairs. We must disabuse our minds of all ideas of tall masts straining under a weight of canvas, sail above sail. The Corsairs' vessels were long, narrow rowboats, carrying indeed a sail or two, but depending for safety and movement mainly upon the oars. The boats were called galleys, galleots, brigantines, galeotas ligeras, or vergatines, or frigatas, etc., according to their size. A galleot is a small galley, while a brigantine may be called a quarter galley. The number of men to each oar varies, too, according to the vessel's size. A galley may have as many as 4 to 6 men working side by side to each oar, a galleot but 2 or 3, and a brigantine 1. But in so small a craft as the last, each man must be a fighter as well as an oarsman, whereas the larger vessels of the Corsairs were rowed entirely by Christian slaves. The galley is the type of all these vessels, and those who are curious about the minutest details of building and equipping galleys need only consult Master Joseph Furtenbach's Architektura Navalis, das ist von dem Schiffgebau auf dem Meer und Sekusten zu gebrauchen, printed in the town of Ulm, in the Holy Roman Empire, by Honam Saun, in 1629. Anyone could construct a galley from the numerous plans and elevations and sections and finished views, some of which are here reproduced, in this interesting and precise work. Furtenbach is an enthusiastic admirer of a ship's beauties, and he had seen all varieties, for his trade took him to Venice, where he had a galleasse, and he had doubtless viewed many a Corsair fleet, since he could remember the battle of Lepanto and the death of Ochiali. His zeal runs clean away with him when he describes a Stolo, or great flagship, Capitanea Galea, of Malta, in her pomp and dignity and lordliness, as she rides the seas to the rhythmical beat of her many oars, or easies, with every blade suspended motionless above the waves like the wings of a poised falcon. A galley such as this is a princely, nay, a royal and imperial vassello di remo, and much the most suitable, he adds, for the uses of peace and of war in the Mediterranean Sea. A galley may be 180 or 190 spans long. Furtenbach measures a ship by palmi, which varied from 9 to 10 inches in different places in Italy. Say 150 feet, the length of an old 74 frigate, but with hardly a fifth of its cubit contents, and its greatest beam is 25 spans broad. The one engraved on page 37 is evidently an admiral's galley of the Knights of Malta. She carries 2 masts, the albero maestro, or mainmast, and the trinchetto, or foremast, each with a great lateen sail. The Genoese and Venetians set the models of these vessels, and the Italian terms were generally used in all European navigation till the northern nations took the lead in sailing ships. These sails are often clewed up, however, for the mariner of the 16th century was ill practised in the art of tacking, and very fearful of losing sight of land for long, so that unless he had a wind fair astern, he preferred to trust to his oars. A short deck at the prow and poop served the one to carry the fighting men and trumpeters and yardsmen, and to provide cover for the 4 guns, the other to accommodate the knights and gentlemen, and especially the admiral or captain, who sits at the stern under a red damask canopy embroidered with gold, surveying the crew, surrounded by the chivalry of the religion, whose white cross waves on the taffety standard over their head, and shines upon various pennants and burgees aloft. Behind, overlooking the roof of the poop, stands the pilot, who steers the ship by the tiller in his hand. Between the two decks and the ship's waist is the propelling power. 54 benches or banks, 27 aside, support each 4 or 5 slaves, whose whole business in life is to tug at the 54 oars. This flagship is a Christian vessel, so the rowers are either Turkish and Moorish captives or Christian convicts. If it were a corsair, the rowers would all be Christian prisoners. In earlier days the galleys were rowed by freemen, and so late as 1500 the Moors of Algiers pulled their own brigantines to the attack of Spanish villages. But their boats were light, and a single man could pull the oar. 2 or 3 were needed for a galleot, and as many sometimes as 6 for each oar of a large galley. It was impossible to induce freemen to toil at the oar, sweating close together, for hour after hour, not sitting, but leaping on the bench in order to throw their whole weight on the oar. Think of 6 men chained to a bench, naked as when they were born, one foot on the stretcher, the other on the bench in front, holding an immensely heavy oar, 15 feet long, bending forwards to the stern with arms at full reach to clear the backs of the rowers in front, who bend likewise, and then, having got forward, shoving up the oar's end to let the blade catch the water, then throwing their bodies back on to the groaning bench. A galley oar sometimes pulls thus for 10, 12, or even 20 hours without a moment's rest. The boatswain or other sailor, in such a stress, puts a piece of bread steeped in wine in the wretched rower's mouth to stop fainting, and then the captain shouts the order to redouble the lash. If a slave falls exhausted upon his oar, which often chances, he is flogged till he is taken for dead, and then pitched unceremoniously into the sea. Those who have not seen a galley at sea, especially in chasing or being chased, cannot well conceive the shock such a spectacle must give to a heart capable of the least tincture of commiseration. To behold ranks and files of half-naked, half-starved, half-tanned, meagre wretches chained to a plank, from whence they remove not, for months together, commonly half a year, urged on, even beyond human strength, with cruel and repeated blows on their bare flesh, to an incessant continuation of the most violent of all exercises, and this for whole days and nights successively, which often happens in a furious chase, when one party, like vultures, is hurried on almost as eagerly after their prey as is the weaker party hurried away in hopes of preserving life and liberty. Sometimes a galley slave worked as long as 20 years, sometimes for all his miserable life, at this fearful calling. The poor creatures were chained so close together in their narrow bench, a sharp cut was the characteristic of the galley, that they could not sleep at full length. Sometimes 7 men, on French galleys too in the last century, had to live and sleep in a space 10 feet by 4. The whole ship was a sea of hopeless faces, and between the 2 lines of rowers ran the bridge, and on it stood 2 boatswains, comiti, armed with long whips, which they laid on to the bare backs of the rowers with merciless severity. Furtenbach gives a picture of the 2 boatswains in grimly humorous verse. How they stand. Be clad, be laced, be trimmed, with many knots bespick, embroidered, padded, tied, all feathers and all flap, curly and quaid, equipped curious of hood and cap. And how they ever stolidly smite the crew with the bastinado, or give them a backward prod in the naked flesh, as they ply, with a point that pricks like a goad when powder and shot is the cry, in order to send the Turks to Davy's wet locker, as John of Austria nipped them and riddled them with ball, as soon as his eyes fell on them, and ducked or slaughtered them all. and how the boatswain's dreaded whistle shrieked through the ship, for they hearkened to such a blast, through all the swish and sweat, through rattle, and rumpus, and raps, and the kicks and cuffs that they get, through the chatter and tread, and the rudder's wash, and the dismal clank of the shameful chain which forever binds the slave to the bank. To this may be added Captain Pantero Pantera's description of the boatswain's demeanor. He should appear kindly towards the crew, assist it, pet it, but without undue familiarity, be, in short, its guardian, and in some sort its father, remembering that when all's said, 'tis human flesh, and human flesh in direst misery. This terrible living grave of a galley, let us remember, is depicted from Christian models. 150 years ago such scenes might be witnessed on many a European vessel. The Corsairs of Algiers only served their enemies as they served them. Their galley slaves were no worse treated, to say the least, than were Doria's or the King of France's own. Rank and delicate nurture were respected on neither side. A gallant Corsair like Dragut had to drag his chain and pull his insatiable oar like any convict at the treadmill, and a future Grand Master of Malta might chance to take his seat on the rowing bench beside commonest scoundrel of Naples. No one seemed to observe the horrible brutality of the service, where each man, let him be never so refined, was compelled to endure the filth and vermin of his neighbor, who might be half a savage, and was bound to become wholly one. And when Madame de Grignan wrote an account of a visit to a galley, her friend Madame de Sévigné replied that she would much like to see this sort of hell, and the men groaning day and night under the weight of their chains. Autres temps, autres mœurs. Furtenbach tells us much more about the galley, and how it was rigged out with brilliant cloths on the bulwarks on fête days, how the biscuit was made to last 6 or 8 months, each slave getting 28 ounces thrice a week, and a spoonful of some mess of rice or bones or green stuff; of the trouble of keeping the water cans under the benches full and fairly fresh. The full complement of a large galley included, he says, besides about 270 rowers and the captain, chaplain, doctor, scrivener, boatswains, and master or pilot, 10 or 15 gentlemen adventurers, friends of the captain, sharing his mess, and berthed in the poop; 12 helmsmen, timonieri; 6 foretop A.B.s; 10 warders for the captives; 12 ordinary seamen; 4 gunners; a carpenter, smith, cooper, and a couple of cooks, together with 50 or 60 soldiers, so that the whole equipage of a fighting galley must have reached a total of about 400 men. What is true of a European galley is also generally applicable to a Barbary galleot, except that the latter was generally smaller and lighter, and had commonly but one mast, and no castle on the prow. The Algerines preferred fighting on galleots of 18 to 24 banks of oars, as more manageable than larger ships. The crew of about 200 men was very densely packed, and about 100 soldiers armed with muskets, bows, and scimitars occupied the poop. Heddo has described the general system of the Corsairs as he knew it at the close of the 16th century, and his account, here summarized, holds good for earlier and somewhat later periods. These vessels are perpetually building or repairing at Algiers. The builders are all Christians who have a monthly pay from the treasury of 6, 8, or 10 quarter dollars, with a daily allowance of 3 loaves of the same bread with the Turkish soldiery, who have 4. Some of the upper rank of these masters have 6 and even 8 of these loaves, nor has any of their workmen, as carpenters, caulkers, coopers, oar-makers, smiths, etc., fewer than 3. The bailick, or common magazine, never wants slaves of all useful callings, nor is it probable that they should ever have a scarcity of such, while they are continually bringing in incredible numbers of Christians of all nations. The captains, too, have their private artificer slaves, whom they buy for high prices and take with them on the cruise, and hire them out to help the bailick workmen when ashore. The number of vessels possessed at any one time by the Algerines appears to have never been large. Barbarossa and Dragut were content with small squadrons, Ochiali had but 15 Algerine galleys at Lepanto. Heddo says that at the close of the 16th century, 1581, the Algerines possessed 36 galleots or galleys, made up of 3 of 24 banks, 1 of 23, 11 of 22, 8 of 20, 1 of 19, 10 of 18, and 2 of 15, and these were, all but 14, commanded by renegades. They had besides a certain number of brigantines of 14 banks, chiefly belonging to Moors at Shershel. This agrees substantially with Father Dan's account, 1634, who says that there were in 1588 35 galleys or brigantines (he means galleots), of which all but 11 were commanded by renegades. Heddo gives the list of the 35 captains from which the following names are selected: Jafar the Pasha, Hungarian; Memi, Albanian; Murad, French; Deli Memi, Greek; Murad Reis, Albanian; Ferru Reis, Genoese; Murad Maltrapillo and Yusuf, Spaniards; Memi Reis and Memi Gancho, Venetians; Murad the Less, Greek; Memi the Corsican; Memi the Calabrian; Montes the Sicilian, and so forth, most of whom commanded galleys of 22 to 24 banks. It was a pretty sight to see the launching of a galley. After the long months of labor, after felling the oak and pine in the forests of Shershel, and carrying the fashioned planks on camels, mules, or their own shoulders, some 30 miles to the seashore, or perhaps breaking up some unwieldy prize vessel taken from the Spaniards or Venetians. After all the sawing and fitting and caulking and painting, then at last comes the day of rejoicing for the Christian slaves, who alone have done the work, for no Mussulman would offer to put a finger to the building of a vessel, saving a few Morisco oar-makers and caulkers. Then the armadores, or owners of the new galleot, as soon as it is finished, come down with presents of money and clothes, and hang them upon the mast and rigging, to the value of 200 or 300 ducats, to be divided among their slaves, whose only pay till that day has been the daily loaves. Then again, on the day of launching, after the vessel has been keeled over, and the bottom carefully greased from stem to stern, more presents from owners and captains to the workmen, to say nothing of a hearty dinner, and a great straining and shoving of brawny arms and bare backs, a shout of Allahu Akbar, God is most great, as the sheep is slaughtered over the vessel's prow, a symbol, they said, of the Christian blood to be shed, and the galleot glides into the water prepared for her career of devastation. Built by Christians and manned by Christians, commanded probably by a quondam Christian, she sallies forth to prey upon Christendom. The rowers, if possible, were all Christian slaves, belonging to the owners. But when these were not numerous enough, other slaves, or Arabs and Moors, were hired at 10 ducats the trip, prize or no prize. If he was able, the captain, Reis, would build and furnish out his own vessel, entirely at his own cost, in hope of greater profit, but often he had not the means, and then he would call in the aid of one or more armadores. These were often speculative shopkeepers who invested in a part share of a galleot on the chance of a prize, and who often discovered that ruin lay in so hazardous a lottery. The complement of soldiers, whether volunteers, Levants, consisting of Turks, renegades, or Korogler, i.e., Creoles, natives, Turks born on the soil, or, if these cannot be had, ordinary Moors or Ottoman Janissaries, varied with the vessel's size, but generally was calculated at 2 to each oar, because there was just room for 2 men to sit beside each bank of rowers. They were not paid unless they took a prize, nor were they supplied with anything more than biscuit, vinegar, and oil. Everything else, even their blankets, they found themselves. The soldiers were under the command of their own aga, who was entirely independent of the Reis, and formed an efficient check upon the officer's conduct. Vinegar and water, with a few drops of oil on the surface, formed the chief drink of the galley slaves, and their food was moistened biscuit or rusk, and an occasional mess of gruel, burgol. Nor was this given out when hard rowing was needed, for oars move slackly on a full stomach. It was usual to consult an auguration book and a marabut, or saint, before deciding on a fortunate day for putting to sea, and these saints expected a share of the prize money. Fridays and Sundays were the favorite days for sailing. A gun is fired in honor of their tutelary patron. "God speed us," shout the crew. "God send you a prize," reply the crowd on the shore, and the galleot swiftly glides away on its destructive path. The Algerines, says Haedo, generally speaking, are out upon the cruise winter and summer, the whole year round, and so devoid of dread, they roam these eastern and western seas, laughing all the while at the Christian galleys, which lie trumpeting, gaming, and banqueting in the ports of Christendom, neither more nor less than if they went a hunting hares and rabbits, killing here one and there another. Nay, far from being under apprehension, they are certain of their game, since their galleots are so extremely light and nimble, and in such excellent order as they always are, whereas, on the contrary, the Christian galleys are so heavy, so embarrassed, and in such bad order and confusion, that it is utterly in vain to think of giving them chase, or of preventing them from going and coming, and doing just as they theirselves please. This is the occasion that when at any time the Christian galleys chase them, their custom is, by way of game and snare, to point to their fresh tallowed poops, as they glide along like fishes before them, all one as if they showed them their backs to salute. And as in the cruising art, by continual practice they are so very expert, and withal, for our sins, so daring, presumptuous, and fortunate, in a few days from leaving Algiers they return laden with infinite wealth and captives, and are able to make 3 or 4 voyages in a year, and even more if they are inclined to exert themselves. Those who have been cruising westward when they have taken a prize, conduct it to sell at Tétouan, El Arish, etc., in the kingdom of Fez, as do those who have been eastward, in the states of Tunis and Tripoli, where, refurnishing themselves with provisions, etc., they instantly set out again, and again return with cargoes of Christians and their effects. If it sometimes happens, more particularly in winter, that they have roamed about for any considerable time without lighting on any booty, they retire to some one of these 7 places, viz., if they had been in the west, their retreats were Tétouan, El Arish, or Usali. Those who came from the Spanish coasts went to the island Formentada, and such as had been eastward retired to the island San Pedro, near Sardinia, the mouths of Bonifacio in Corsica, or the islands Lipari and Strombolo, near Sicily and Calabria. And there, what with the conveniency of those commodious ports and harbors, and the fine springs and fountains of water, with the plenty of wood for fuel they meet with, added to the careless negligence of the Christian galleys, who scarce think it their business to seek for them, they there, very much at their ease, regaled themselves with stretched out legs, waiting to intercept the paces of Christian ships, which come there and deliver themselves into their clutches. Father Dan describes their mode of attack as perfectly ferocious. Flying a foreign flag, they lure the unsuspecting victim within striking distance, and then the gunners, generally renegades, ply the shot with unabated rapidity, while the sailors and boatswains chain the slaves, that they may not take part in the struggle. The fighting men stand ready, their arms bared, muskets primed, and scimitars flashing, waiting for the order to board. Their war cry was appalling, and the fury of the onslaught was such as to strike panic into the stoutest heart. When a prize was taken, the booty was divided with scrupulous honesty between the owners and the captors, with a certain proportion, varying from a fifth to an eighth, reserved for the Beylik, or government, who also claimed the hulks. Of the remainder, half went to the owners and reis, the other half to the crew and soldiers. The principal officers took each 3 shares, the gunners and helmsmen 2, and the soldiers and swabbers 1. The Christian slaves received from 1 1/2 to 3 shares apiece. A scrivener saw to the accuracy of the division. If the prize was a very large one, the captors usually towed it into Algiers at once, but small vessels were generally sent home under a lieutenant and a jury crew of Moors. There is no mistaking the aspect of a Corsair who has secured a prize, for he fires gun after gun as he draws near the port, utterly regardless of powder. The moment he is in the roads, the Lyman Reis, or port admiral, goes on board and takes his report to the Pasha. Then the galleot enters the port, and all the oars are dropped into the water and towed ashore, so that no Christian captives may make off with the ship in the absence of the captain and troops. Ashore all is bustle and delighted confusion. The dullness of trade, which is the normal condition of Algiers between the arrivals of prizes, is forgotten in the joy of renewed wealth. The erstwhile shabby now go strutting about, pranked out in gay raiment, the commerce of the bar rooms is brisk, and every one thinks only of enjoying himself. Algiers is en fête. End of Part 2, Chapter 16. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista.